From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. Everybody who's sailing and everybody who's spending time in powerboats is looking at the water and wondering if sea level is going to rise. We keep seeing news about it, and we keep hearing about the glaciers in Greenland melting. We see all these videos that frighten us, but who's trying to prevent that from happening, and who knows the most about it? Well, the NRDC is a very significant nonprofit with a track record of effectiveness in moving legislation. And so to talk to us all about changing flood policy for a changing climate, we've brought with us today Joel Scata, senior attorney at the National Resources Defense Council. So Joel, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Talk to us a little bit about how we should change flood policy for what is going to be and is a changing climate.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for inviting me to the Wednesday Luncheon. As Ron mentioned, I'm Joel Scata. I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I work on our climate adaptation team. The climate adaptation team focuses on how to help communities prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change, in particular, sea level rise, bigger rainstorms, and other disasters that are climate related. Today, I'm going to be talking about flood policy, and in particular, the National Flood Insurance Program. So the National Flood Insurance Program has the potential to be really the linchpin in our nation's strategy for dealing with more frequent and costly flood disasters. However, as currently structured, the NFIP, in many ways, is a liability for the nation. Given the substantial amount of credible scientific evidence concerning climate change's role in increasing flood risk, coupled with growing development, the nation cannot continue to rely on this outdated program. So this presentation is really going to focus on how smart policy and the law both mandate that the NFIP be reformed to adequately account for the increasing risk of flooding due to climate change and future development.
Tell us a little bit about the NRDC. I'm familiar with it, but many of our guests would benefit from learning more about the NRDC. When was it founded? How many lawyers? Give me some milestones of your effectiveness.
Sure. So the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, is an international environmental and public health nonprofit that really got its start back in the 60s when a group of young attorneys partnered to really start litigating environmental cases. NRDC has been really instrumental in some of the development of legislation that I think many are familiar with, like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, National Environmental Policy Act. We really, as an institution, have pushed for both federal policy as well as challenging bad actors in court to make sure that the United States has a healthy environment for its citizens. So right now, we are focused on a multitude of issues, from helping communities prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate change, to helping reduce carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, to try and get the lead out of water. So one of the big areas that we focus on is public health. And one of the issues right now is that many of the pipes providing water to citizens across the country are made out of lead. And that can lead to a lot of poor health impacts, especially amongst children. So that's become a big advocacy area for NRDC. And altogether, we really try to push for just a better, healthier environment for citizens in the United States.
How many lawyers are there in NRDC?
There's roughly about 1,000 staff at NRDC, and that's comprised of lawyers, scientists, community advocates. We're a pretty broad institution in terms of how we advocate and how we litigate and legislate in the US as well as abroad. We have offices in Beijing and in India.
And where are you stationed?
I'm based in Chicago in our Midwest office.
And where do you have offices? Where does NRDC have offices in America?
So in the United States, we have offices in New York, Washington, D.C., where I am, Chicago, Bozeman, Montana, Santa Monica, and San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. How many lawyers in the San Francisco office?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I know it's one of our bigger offices. A lot of the lawyers in the San Francisco office do a combination of work that are central to California. So looking at how to improve the Delta, looking at how to improve rivers, especially in regards to salmon runs, and then also kind of expanding into clean air, it being an important issue in California. So a lot of our lawyers out of the San Francisco and Santa Monica offices work on issues related to improving air quality.
How are you funded?
We're funded through both membership organizations. We have, I think, 3 million members and activists that participate with NRDC. And then we also receive a lot of grant funding.
Great. Well, I want to join. I don't think I've
please
been
do.
a member for years, but I want to be a member again.
So flooding is the most common and costly disaster in the United States, and it has been increasing in recent decades. As you can see on this slide, orange circles are where the most repeatedly flooded properties are located in the United States. And so these are properties that have flooded more than 3 or 4 times. And that number has really started to grow in recent years because of the number of flood disasters that are continuing to occur. And then current and future emissions of greenhouse gases, really the primary drivers of climate change, will continue to have a warming effect on the climate for the foreseeable future. Current and future emissions of greenhouse gases, which are the primary drivers of climate change, will continue to have a warming effect on the climate for the foreseeable future. This warming effect will lead to increases in temperature that will in turn lead to sea level rise and bigger rainstorms. When layered onto increasing development, population growth in the floodplains, this combination of factors will really exacerbate flood risks in the United States. So the global mean sea level has risen about 7 to 8 inches since 1900, with 3 of those inches occurring since 1993. And there's a really strong, high scientific consensus and confidence that a significant fraction of the sea level rise since 1900 is associated with man-made climate change. And climate warming is driving both increases in ocean mass through the melting of land-based ice, so like melting of ice on Greenland and Antarctica, as well as ocean volume. As the ocean heats up, the water expands in volume, much like when you boil a pot of water, the water expands inside the pot of water. If global average sea level increase, or if global average temperature increases between 4 degrees and 8.6 degrees Fahrenheit, sea level rise is very likely, about 90% probability to rise by 0.6 feet by 2030, 1.2 feet by 2050, and by upwards of 4 feet by 2100 relative to the year 2000. So that's pretty significant, having a 4-foot rise in sea level on average. And a lot of areas along the United States coastline will actually see higher sea level rise due to just relative factors such as different geographic structures and just different climate patterns. And so you could even see upwards of 6 feet of sea level rise in some areas of the United States by 2100. However, even if human-caused greenhouse gas emissions stop today, so there's no more CO2 being put off into the atmosphere by cars or trucks, sea level will still rise by a foot by 2100 just due to carbon dioxide amounts that are kind of baked into the atmosphere. Climate change has noticeably influenced important drivers of flooding, such as rainfall and snowmelt. And there's this well-established relationship between temperature and humidity, which suggests that the warmer the atmosphere, the more moisture that it can hold. So as the climate heats up and as temperatures rise, more water will be trapped in the atmosphere, more water moisture, and that will lead to bigger rain events. So as you can see on the slide, the darker areas show a significant increase in what is considered like these 1% rain events. A 1% rain event is an event you might expect to see once in 100 years. But because of climate change, we're starting to see them more frequently. In the last half century, you can see there's been a significant increase in these major rainstorm events. Heavy precipitation events have become more frequent over that time period, with the biggest changes happening in the Midwest here with like 42% change, the Northeast with a 55% change, as well as places in the South. And you will start to see that here there's a 10% increase in the Southwest, which is big rainstorm events, compared to a 2% decrease in just average rain. And so what that means is like in the Southwest, like California area, on average, rain is going down. You will see in the bigger rainstorm events, these really huge rainstorms, that's going up. And that leads to bigger floods in general. So even without bigger rainstorm events or sea level rise due to climate change, damages from coastal and inland flooding are projected to increase significantly in the United States because of population growth and more development in flood-prone areas. Tens of millions of people are exposed to significant flooding in the United States. This graph shows there's about 40.8 million people, which is about 13% of the US population, that live in what's considered a 100-year floodplain, or not, which is an area that sees flooding once every 100 years to a certain extent. So there's like a 1% chance any given year that you'll see that kind of flooding. And because this flooding is increasing due to climate change, you're starting to see increase in the number of people that will actually be impacted. So here on this chart, you can see that the present day current study, this is the number of people on average that are exposed to 1 in a 100-year flood. But as the climate changes, whether that's this scenario, which is we reduce emissions through government initiatives, and we try to stave off climate change, you're still going to see more people by 2050 in the floodplain, and even more by 2100. And then if we fail to address climate change, if we fail to reduce emissions, so climate change just runs amok, you'll see a significant increase in the number of people in the flood zone. And you can see that down here, especially in the New England area, the Midwest area, there will be a huge increase in the number of people in flood-prone regions just due to the impacts of climate change. So one of the things that I'll be addressing in the presentation is FEMA flood maps. So FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, maps flood-prone regions in the United States. However, their maps are often outdated and often outdated by decades. And the problem with that is it doesn't capture enough people. It doesn't show how many people are actually living in the floodplain. So here, where it says present day FEMA, that's FEMA's estimate of how many people are in a floodplain. And then over here, where it says present day current study, this was a study done by a group of researchers that found that there was actually a significantly higher number of people living in a 100-year floodplain than that was being captured by FEMA flood maps. And so that's something that FEMA really needs to update, is make sure not only are their maps current, but their maps need to be forward-looking, because it fails to account for how the floodplain is going to change due to sea level rise and bigger rainstorm events, which means that people are building in areas that they think are safe, but won't be in the future. So what can be done about these changes in floodplains, these changes in flood risk? And that's really forward-looking construction and land use standards and mapping future flood conditions to reduce risk. These two images on the slide show that FEMA had conducted a study in 2020 that looked at how better construction standards, building to a higher flood risk, building to a future with more significant flooding versus just building to the status quo, helps reduce floodplain damages. And over here, where it says Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Cedar Rapids is a very flood-prone community in the state of Iowa. And after 2008, where they had significant flooding that cost billions of dollars in damage, they took an initiative to rebuild to a way that was looking at the future of flooding due to climate change and built to be much stronger. And when a flood came again that was similar in size, they didn't see as much damage because they were building to a higher standard. And that's what really needs to happen with the National Flood Insurance Program. So Congress established the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968 to reduce flood damages nationwide and to ease the federal government's financial burden for providing disaster recovery assistance. To achieve this goal, the NFIP is designed to perform three primary functions. One, it provides federally backed flood insurance to property owners and renters. Two, it establishes minimum building, land use, and floodplain management criteria, which is really designed to reduce flood damage for participating communities. So if you want to buy federally backed flood insurance, which is really the only flood insurance available in the United States, you have to live in a community that joins the NFIP, and that community has to adopt these minimum standards for building and land use. And three, it was really designed to help map these flood risk areas. Congress required that the NFIP have building, land use, and floodplain management that to the maximum extent feasible, which is where the legal petition that we filed will come into play, and I'll talk about that later, that these standards to the maximum extent feasible will limit risky development and reduce flood damages. So Congress required the National Flood Insurance Program to have building and land use requirements that to the maximum extent feasible would limit risky development in the floodplains and limit and reduce flood damages. That's something that phrase, to the maximum extent feasible, is something just to keep in mind. It'll become important later on in the presentation, but it's a legal standard that we used, NRDC used, to file a petition for rulemaking. However, that criteria that I talked about that the Congress mandated FEMA implement has not been updated since Gerald Ford was president. And that goes back to like the late 1970s, well before I was even born. And so that means that these standards are grossly out of date, and they're not ready, and they're not helping communities prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate change that are related to flooding. Another shortcoming of the flood insurance program are these flood maps that I had mentioned. NFIP flood maps are designed to help communities determine where to build and where to apply the minimum standards. Unfortunately, those maps are often out of date, sometimes by decades. And another huge problem with them is that they're backward looking. They only look at the past to determine how flooding is going to happen in the future. But climate change is really a wrench thrown into the gears of that process, because climate change is changing how flooding is happening, altering how it's happened in the past. And so these maps really need to be forward-looking. They need to account for what future flooding is going to be like, not just what past flooding is going to be like, so communities can make informed decisions about where to build and where people should live. Because of these shortcomings, the number of flood insurance claims has really increased in recent years. Basically, the total volume of annual claims, so that's a claim someone makes for flooding on their property that they file with FEMA, has increased on average by 2,000 claims each year. And even excluding high loss years like 2005, which was Katrina, 2012, which was Sandy, or 2017, which was Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the number of claims is still increasing significantly each year. And so this graph that you see here, it says post-firm SFHA payments as percent of all payments. It's a bit of a wonky title, but basically what that means is that post-firm are properties that are built after a community joins the National Flood Insurance Program and starts requiring all construction to meet the minimum standards that FEMA requires for community to participate. And you can see that on this chart, the number of claims that those properties file, and these are properties that are supposed to be built to a standard that reduces flooding, are increasing on average every year. And that means that the standards then are inadequate. They aren't preparing communities for the flooding that we're seeing in the future because of climate change. And so those standards really need to be updated. So FIRM means Flood Insurance Rate Map. So when a community joins the National Flood Insurance Program, their flood-prone areas are mapped, and anything in that mapped area has to abide by these minimum codes and standards. SFHA is just the term for flood maps that FEMA uses. It's like standard flood home appraisal maps. It would have been better just to say post-firm flood map payments, but this is the official title that FEMA uses.
This is a chart that shows the money FEMA's paid out for flood damage to people who applied for their FEMA insurance after a flood. And if I get the message, for over the last 40 years, that has gone up 25% on average. The population over that same period has gone up quite a bit too. Is this not just an increase in the number of homes that are in, flood areas? Or is this telling me, no, actually the amount of damage done gone up? Also, inflation over that period of time might have gone up an average of 25%, gone up more than that over 40 years.
Great question. On this graph, you only see what are called these post-firm properties, these post-flood insurance rate map properties. There are also what are called pre-firm properties, which were properties that were built before a community joined the flood insurance program. Those properties weren't built to the same standards. They were built to whatever code was in place before a community joined and had to adopt these minimum standards for floodplain management. And so these properties that you see that are having an increase in the number of damages, one factor is, yes, the more properties that are built, the more that are considered what are post-firm. But because that they're being built to a flood protective standard, you would think that there wouldn't be such an increase in the number of these damages in comparison to pre-firm properties. But as the next slide shows, the number of claims by pre-firm and post-firm status per decade. So basically, this is showing that on average, claims by properties that were built before a community joined the flood insurance program and had to meet these minimum standards are increasing, but they're staying relatively the same. Whereas properties that have joined after the flood insurance program has started, yes, there's more of those properties because as development continues, those properties have to meet these minimum standards. Those properties are increasing in claims, meaning that they really are inadequate in terms of how they are built for the increasing number of flooding events that we're seeing each year. And so that's what this graph shows. It's the blue lines are the pre-firm properties. These are properties that were built before the flood insurance program, didn't have to abide by any minimum codes and standards for flood safety. The yellow bar graphs are ones that are built after the flood insurance program has started. And these are ones that are supposed to be built to a minimum standard to reduce flooding.
So the summary of this chart is that buildings built to the spec that FEMA has proposed are suffering less damage and have smaller insurance claims than the older style buildings.
What this is showing is that you should see a lesser amount of damage from these post-firm buildings because they are built to a higher standard. But as the timeline goes from 1980 to 2018, the number of claims by these newer properties, these newer homes, are increasing in comparison to your original homes. And that's because flooding is becoming more severe. And so even the homes that were built to a newer standard are starting to flood. And that's why you're starting to see an increase in the size of the yellow bars.
But why are we seeing lesser increase in the older buildings?
You're seeing less of an increase because these buildings tend to flood anyway. Some of them, as they have flooded, get demolished. And so that's kind of what leads to some of this decrease from 2000 to 2010, 2009 to 2000, and then 2010 to 2018. But what this graph is really trying to show is that in comparison between homes that were built before the floodplain program started and then homes that were built after, the bigger the floods become, the more that the properties that have built to a higher standard are starting to flood. And that's why it's really important that the overall standards be updated for the flood insurance program.
So you're saying that the older buildings are being demolished and they're getting wiped out. So there's fewer of them and fewer claims about them. And the newer ones, you're increasing the claims on them. And one of the reasons is because the standard to which the new buildings are built has not been updated. And that's one of the things you want to do. You want to change that policy and change the criteria that they're using to define what a building should be built.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And that's what we'll talk about going forward. So as you can see, the flood insurance program regulations for building and land use need to be updated. And that's what those graphs that we just saw kind of illustrated. In 2021, January 2021, NRDC, in partnership with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, filed a legal petition to challenge FEMA to update their rules. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, anyone has a right to challenge an agency to either update or amend their rules about whatever. And in case of FEMA, it was the minimum standards and regulations for building in a floodplain. And as I mentioned before, there was that phrase, maximum extent feasible. That phrase, maximum extent feasible, was actually in statute. Congress passed a statute that said that any of the regulations that FEMA implements to start the program and to dictate how and where to build in a floodplain have to, the maximum extent feasible, try to reduce floodplain damages and flood damages. And what we've seen, because flooding is increasing and the number of damages are increasing, those standards really aren't to the maximum extent feasible, reducing flood damages, because damages are going up instead of down. And so we challenge FEMA on that, saying that you're failing to meet your statutory duty implemented by Congress, and you need to update your regulations. And so FEMA responded to our petition that summer of 2021, in agreement. And they said that, yes, we need to update these standards. And so they put out in October of that year, October of 2021, what's called a request for information, which really kicks off the rulemaking process. And a request for information basically states that the agency would like to implement rule changes, but they want to know how to do that. And they put out a series of questions asking various stakeholders what they should do to update the standards. And here on this slide is a quote from a stakeholder in Puerto Rico, where there's been significant flood damage due to Hurricane Maria and other hurricanes. And the background image is the floodplain map that FEMA produces. So you can see the kind of like the blue areas here are where the floodplain is. And then over here is considered outside the floodplain. But what's happening is that the flooding is going outside of this blue area and starting to impact other areas that aren't considered flood prone. And that's because the maps only look to the past. They're not looking to what's happening in the future of climate change. And that's what we're trying to address through our petition for rulemaking, is that FEMA start considering what's happening in the future with flooding. So what did we call for? So NRDC has requested multiple changes to the flood insurance program. The first one is called, has to do with building requirements. And so under the flood insurance program, any home that's built in the 100-year floodplain has to be built to the height of the 100-year flood. But that's a problem because their 100-year flood is based on outdated data. So actually, you're starting to see homes that are built to what's considered a safe level flooding. And you're starting to see a lot more of those homes flood. And so what NRDC requested in our legal petition is that they amend 44 CFR 60.3, which is the regulatory citation that FEMA uses, and to require that all non-critical, your average home, your average office building, built with future flooding in mind. So instead of just building to the height of the 100-year flood, build 2 feet above that in riverine zones, so that if there is an alteration in what actually constitutes the 100-year flood, you have a measure of safety built in. And then for coastal zones, because we know that sea level rise is occurring, build to what might happen at the end of the century, which is 4 feet of sea level rise, plus some additional measure of safety. And so, when you build a new house, don't just build it to the, on grade to the height of the flood, build above that. So you have some more safety mechanisms built in.
So what you said is, rather than build to the old 100-year flood level, you're proposing that it's requirement to build 2 feet above that, 4 feet above the flood level.
Yes.
That's your proposal. Okay.
Yep. And that's standard. Yeah. And that's starting to become standard practice. So in places like New York and Wisconsin, the state already mandates that homes built in the 100-year floodplain be built 2 feet above that height because they have such issues of flooding. A lot of communities within California actually require higher standards. And so what we're trying to do is push FEMA to meet these higher standards, because if communities are already on their own taking the initiative to build to a higher standard because they realize that the standards that FEMA has are outdated and aren't working, that means FEMA is not meeting its mandatory duty to ensure that the standards are to the maximum extent feasible, reducing flood risk. One of the problems with the flood insurance program is that there is not a different standard for what's considered critical infrastructure. That's infrastructure that, if it floods, has a much broader impact on a community than just if your average home floods. That's infrastructure like hospitals, police stations, toxic waste facilities. Right now, under the flood insurance program, those structures are required to meet the same standards as your average home, but the impact of them flooding is much more significant. And so NRDC in its legal petition pushed FEMA to make sure that those critical facilities were built to a higher standard than your average home. And so, as you can see on the slide, we challenged them on 44 CFR 60.3, which is a legal citation, to change that. And so we want any new infrastructure, critical infrastructure, or substantially damaged infrastructure that's been damaged by more than 50% of its value and has to be rebuilt, to be located outside the 2% annual chance floodplain, which is the 500-year floodplain, which is the average requirement for other disaster programs. Or if it can't be located outside that floodplain, then it has to be elevated or built above the 2% floodplain plus freeboard, which is to account for future flood risk and future conditions. And so that's what we're really trying to do, is make sure that the infrastructure that's being built today can last as long as intended, and by accounting for climate impacts. So those are the building requirements that NRDC and ASFPM have pushed for in their legal petition. The other area that has a huge shortcoming is floodplain mapping. So FEMA, as mandated by Congress, must map floodplain or flood-prone areas across the United States. And they are meant to map areas that are considered a 1 in 100-year chance of flooding. So there's a 1% chance that this type magnitude of flood could happen in this area in any given year. The problem with those maps is that they're based on past information, historical data, and they need to be forward-looking. You don't want to build a home that might last, 30 years, let's say, for your mortgage, or a police station that's going to last 50 or 60 years based on old data. You want to make sure that it lasts as long as intended. And so what flood maps need to do, because flood maps are used for development decisions, they need to make sure that they're accounting for future flood conditions, future flood risk. And you can do that by looking at, what rainstorms might be like 30 years out, 40 years out, what sea level rise is going to be 30, 40 years out, the projections for that, and kind of estimate what the flooding is going to be in return, and then map that. And so what we've challenged here on FEMA is that they have to update their regulations for how they map. So the FIRM, which is the flood insurance rate map, right now just says that if a community wants to map future conditions, they can. But Congress mandated in 2012 that it has to be mapped for every community. It can't just be voluntary. FEMA hasn't changed that policy yet. And so we want to make sure that those regulations that FEMA has, where it just says it can be at the request of the community, is changed to reflect what's actually required by Congress, which is that future conditions have to be mapped on the floodplain maps. And so that's what you see here, mandatory mapping requirements of BD or BW 2012, which stands for Biggert Waters 2012, which was an act that reformed the flood insurance program in 2012 and required that all floodplain maps have to have future conditions on them. FEMA has yet to change their underlying regulations to reflect that mandatory change from Congress. And so that's what you see here, was one of the things that we pushed for. Another area is disclosure. So I'm sure many people on this call have bought and sold homes. And depending on the state in which you live, you will either be told whether that home has flooded before or you won't be told. So for example, I'm going to come back to the slide in a minute, but here's an example of the different states in the United States and the quality of their flood risk disclosure laws. As you can see, states like Louisiana, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Texas, NRDC rated them an A because they require a homeowner to disclose to a potential buyer whether a house is flooded in the past, whether it's required to have flood insurance, and whether it's in a floodplain. And then there's other states that got Fs. There's a lot of states that got Fs that require no disclosure. For example, New York got an F. Even though they have a disclosure form, New York has a loophole where the seller can provide a $500 credit to the buyer to not to disclose. But when it comes to flooding, that's a huge problem because a house that's flooded once is likely to flood again. And the costs of flooding are significant. Even 1 to 2 inches of flood damage to a home can cost anywhere from $25,000 to $35,000 in damage. And so it's really important that when someone's going to buy a home, they know whether or not it's flooded in the past. And so one of the things that NRDC has pushed for is that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, that administers the National Flood Insurance Program, require that real estate disclosure be a requirement of communities that want to participate in the NFIP. So any state that wants its community to participate in the NFIP has to adopt a flood disclosure law. So sellers are required to tell home buyers whether a property has flooded before. On this slide, this is the language that we recommended FEMA use to require that disclosure. So has there been prior physical damage caused by a flood? Has there been a prior insurance claim? If so, what's the cost of that? And then what's is starting to become a bigger issue is whether there has been any obligation under federal law to obtain and maintain flood insurance on the property. So one of the problems with the FEMA maps, as I said, they're outdated, they don't capture all the flooding that's happening, is that if your home is built outside the designated floodplain, you don't have to buy insurance and you're eligible for disaster aid if a flood happens. But once you receive disaster aid to rebuild that property, regardless of future owners, must always carry flood insurance. But if it floods again and it doesn't have flood insurance on it, the current owner is ineligible to receive any assistance or is ineligible to apply for future insurance claims. From members of NRDC, as well as our partner organizations, is that their members have bought homes. They weren't told that they had flooded before. They weren't told that federal government had helped rebuild them. And then when they flooded this time, they were ineligible to receive assistance because they didn't have insurance, because they didn't know it was required. And they would have done something different if they knew it was required, if they knew the seller had told them that. So those are what we're requiring for disclosure. And disclosure is really important because the flood maps only tell you part of the picture. They only show the past, and they only show areas of potential flooding. They don't say whether the home is actually flooded, but that's something a seller would know and could tell a home buyer. So that's why we're requesting disclosure be part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And then the last thing that we've really pushed FEMA to do, and this is all through administrative action. This is all action that FEMA can take on its own through amending the floodplain regulations. So Congress in 1968, when they established the flood insurance program, gave FEMA the authority to implement these minimum standards for building and land use. And because they gave FEMA the authority to start those regulations, FEMA also has the authority to amend them. But as I pointed out before, those regulations have not been amended since Gerald Ford was president. And so the petition for rulemaking puts it all in FEMA's lap. It challenges FEMA to take on this effort on their own without having to go through Congress to get approval to update the standards, because they already have that authority. And so that's what we're really pushing for when we talk about administrative changes. The next area that we're trying to push FEMA to change is mitigation. So right now under the flood insurance program, if you belong to the program and you have flood insurance on your property and you flood, you're eligible for what's called increased cost of compliance funding. So if your property floods and it's damaged by more than 50% of its market value, FEMA will make a grant to you of $30,000 to update your property to make sure it's not flood prone in the future. The problem with that, though, is the $30,000 has not changed. That $30,000 amount has not changed in decades. So what cost maybe $30,000 30, 40 years ago, it doesn't cost $30,000 anymore. It costs $60,000, $100,000. And so this is pushing FEMA to update the grant program that they have, because the concept behind it is by mitigating the property, it's reducing the likelihood of it to flood and the likelihood of it needing flood insurance. And that actually impacts taxpayers, because starting in 2005, FEMA had to start borrowing money from the United States Treasury just to meet the number of claims it was getting, because it was getting so many claims for flood insurance, flooding events, that the money it was bringing in through the program, the payments it was bringing in through people buying flood insurance, weren't covering the costs. So if FEMA was a private insurance company, it would have gone bankrupt. But because it's a federally backed program, taxpayers were taking on that added cost. And so the concept behind pushing for greater mitigation funding is that we're reducing that burden and making people safer. And so that's what this graph shows. So instead of just having $30,000 as part of this regulation, we want FEMA to strike that and insert $60,000 and then add an optional coverage option. Or if you were willing to pay, let's say, an extra, I don't know, $10, $15 per month for your insurance, you could be eligible from $60,000 and instead get $100,000 if you flooded to help mitigate your property. And so that's something that we've really kind of pushed for. So as an overall kind of view of the program, these are all changes that FEMA has the authority to make. It has the authority through statute, and these are all things that should be relatively simple fixes. But the bigger problem is that unless you live in a community that participates in the NFIP, or unless you actually have flood insurance, these regulations won't impact you, which is significant because flooding is starting to expand beyond where FEMA just maps it. And so there are some measures that Congress needs to take on, and these would be the legislative reforms. So one of the problems with the flood insurance program is that for lower income families and families that have been historically redlined, flood insurance can be very expensive. So they're not taking out NFIP flood insurance policies, which means that they're ineligible for disaster aid or ineligible for that ICC funding that I mentioned. And on this chart, I have that Redfin produced, the real estate company, the top 10 metro areas with the greater share of homes at risk in a redlined area. So that means that these homes in like Sacramento, California, that are redlined, which is when back in the 1930s, communities were either redlined or yellow lined. That means like there were areas of the community that were considered undesirable, often related to race. And if people weren't of the right race, they got pushed into these zones. And these zones were often correlated with being more disaster prone. So as you can see in Sacramento, California, 21% of the properties that are considered to be flood prone are in historically redline zones because they were historically communities that the federal home agency, the one that was making a lot of these decisions and grant decisions, funding decisions, mortgage decisions, considered them undesirable. And so they pushed them into these disaster prone areas. Whereas these blue line zones, those are zones that the community in the 30s was considered desirable, tended to be more white and more wealthy, and they're less flood prone because they were safer locations. And so now you have whole communities that have been trapped in these flood prone areas due to decisions that happened back in the 30s and 40s. And that it's very difficult for them to obtain insurance because it's costly. And that's something that FEMA can't change. FEMA can't change the price of insurance, but Congress can.
Homes that are flood prone are more common. There's a higher percentage of them in red-lined or yellow-lined areas than in green-lined or blue-lined areas.
Yes.
What you're saying is that red-lined areas are more flood prone than other homes. When poor people or people of color were pushed into those areas with local zoning policies 50, 60, 80 years ago, those areas subsequently have been proven to be more flood prone. So you're saying these areas where people were forced to live cost more money to repair, are more likely to be flooded than other areas.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So communities of color, lower income communities in the 30s through the housing agency were redlined. They're showed as less desirable, and they're pushed into these disaster prone areas. And that's why today you see a lot of communities that flood. It's the lower income sections of those communities that receive the most damage. And so that's something that Congress really needs to address, because FEMA does not have the authority to address that. And so one of the ways that they can do that, though, is by making flood insurance more available for lower income communities. Your average flood insurance policy could cost anywhere from $1,000 to a couple $1,000s a year. But for a lot of households that are in these flood prone areas, that's in addition to their homeowner's insurance, that's in addition to the cost of their mortgage. It becomes a little too expensive for them to buy flood insurance. But if they can't afford flood insurance, they can't get access to mitigation assistance. They can't make themselves safer, even though they're kind of stuck in these communities that historically have been flood prone due to racist housing practices. So one of the things that NRDC has been advocating for is that FEMA be given the authority from Congress to create a means-tested program where lower income families can get access to flood insurance at a different rate than what it normally would cost. So they can not only expand the number of people in the program, which would help kind of spread out risk, but also to make sure that people who do need the help the most get it. So these communities aren't continually just suffering damage after damage without any assistance. And so what you see here is that on the left-hand side, 51% of all houses in the flood insurance program, or in the 100-year floodplain that do not have flood insurance are considered low income. That is 80%, and low income is defined as having less than 80% of the area median income. And then if you go over to this side of the chart, houses in the 100-year floodplain that have NFIP coverage, that have flood insurance, 74% of them are considered above low income. So the majority of people that have flood insurance are not low income. And that creates a huge problem because the majority of houses that are flood prone, as you can see here, are low income in these kind of, I mean, it differs on geographic location. So obviously like coastal communities right along the beach, those houses are flood prone and they're also more costly. But for a lot of riverine areas, it tends to be lower income families that are flood prone and don't have access to flood insurance. And so that's something that from a legislative standpoint, we're pushing for change. So more people can get into the program and have access to this insurance and kind of overall up the amount of coverage that's happening so people can get assistance to rebuild in a way that's safe. And so that's something that we're pushing on the legislative front. We're looking for sponsors in Congress. So one of the things that NRDC does is that it often looks for changes that can make it in legislation. And what we do there is that we often draft the legislation and then find a sponsor. So now we've worked up some legislation that would change this under law to make flood insurance more affordable for certain families. And then we're in the process of getting that sponsored in Congress. That'll change, obviously, because the current sponsor and current Congress is changing. So in 2023, we'll start all over again because of the new Congress, so we have to have new legislation. But we've seen a lot of bipartisan support for it because floods don't, they don't choose between whether you're red aligned or blue aligned. Floods hit anybody, but who recovers is often impacted by who has the resources to recover. And so that's what we're doing with the affordability component. So overall, flooding is a problem in the United States. It's the most common hazard and it's becoming more frequent due to the impacts of climate change. As sea levels rise and bigger rainstorms become more frequent, you're going to see a lot more flooding happen. And as more flooding happens, you're going to see more property damage. And as more property damage happens, the more likely it is that people are going to be displaced from their homes or out of work because they're trying to repair their home. And so there is a multiplier effect that really kind of happens with flooding. It's not just the house that gets damaged, it's the upending of people's lives and livelihoods. And so that's why that the flood insurance program, because it is the main program for setting the sort of the floor for how to build in the United States' floodplains, as well as setting the floor for insurance and mapping, needs to be reformed because it has the potential to be the linchpin in the United States' approach to flooding, but right now it's more of a liability, and that's because it's outdated. And so that means that FEMA, through administrative action, and Congress, through legislative action, really need to address the underlying problems to make sure that in the future, as we flood more often due to climate change, we are prepared as a nation.
What are your sources for data on sea level rise?
So we use two data sources. One is the data source from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They produce sea level rise information as part of the National Assessment on Climate Change. Since 2000, every 4 years, all the federal agencies have to, kind of in partnership, produce information about climate impacts in the United States. And NOAA is responsible for sea level rise. So we use a lot of their data for determining where future sea level rise is going to be. We also look at UN's data. So there's the international data set. It tends to be a little more conservative in its projections than the United States' projections. But we use both those data sets to determine where sea level rise might be in the future.
Why does sea level rise more in some areas than others? Is this have to do with latitude? What causes it?
Definitely. So there's multiple factors that cause sea level rise to vary depending on location. One is that warmer water expands. So in warmer latitudes, you see the water kind of be a little more expansive and easier to push onto land than in, let's say, your Arctic atmosphere.
Warmer water, you're going to have higher sea level because the water is expanded.
Yes.
Okay, molecules are farther apart because they're warmer. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so that's one area. Okay.
Another area is subsidence. So not only is the ocean rising, but the land's sinking. And the land's sinking due to reasons like it's just because of the last ice age, it's starting to sink from after having been under a lot of pressure from those glaciers. But especially in the southeast, you're starting to see land subside, especially in Louisiana, due to oil and gas production, taking out water from the underlying aquifers, oil reserves, that's causing the land to sink. And so you're seeing a combination of subsidence, different water temperatures, different patterns like the Gulf Stream, the way the Gulf Stream moves, that can kind of push more water in certain areas versus other areas. So there's a lot of different factors that go into why some regions might see even more sea level rise than that's predicted on the global average.
So I'm part Cherokee, and my mother and grandmother both came from Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl in the 30s. And they pointed out before they passed along that all the oil and gas exploration there was causing more and more and more earthquakes and more giant sinkholes. And what you're saying is that is another kind of subsidence. When you take minerals out of the bottom of the ground, you're seeing subsidence of the earth going down to fill in those cavities. So in areas of oil exploration and gas exploration, you're seeing the earth actually lower, and that's separate from the water going higher, but it has the same effect. Effectively, it looks like sea level rise because the earth is going down. Okay.
Yep. And that's why, like in Louisiana, you're going to get more than maybe 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of 2100, because 4 feet is the global average of rise. But you put 4 feet on top, and then on top of lowering land, then it's like 6 feet. And so that's why you start to see huge regional variations.
So the giant Conference of Parties, or COP conference in Egypt, is reviewing the effects of climate change and potential accountability of climate change. And there are many smaller nations who are victims of sea level rise and other climate dangers, which they believe are caused by human exploration and human action. And so they're asking that richer nations who benefited from fossil fuel exploitation to pay for these smaller nations that didn't cause the sea level rise, but which are suffering from it. Rather than have the richer countries that house the exploitive companies that caused the sea level rise, wouldn't it be more appropriate to go after the actual companies that profited from extracting oil and petroleum products? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to go after the companies than the countries?
So that's a great question. And it's one that's actually playing out now across the United States and across the globe, actually, in different courts. Initiative by those who are impacted by climate change to sue major oil companies that are significantly responsible for the amount of greenhouse gases that have been put out into the atmosphere over the last, say, 100 years, to be responsible for damages. It's very hard to meet the legal standards, the thresholds to show liability. And so you see some countries, their success. I think I want to say the Netherlands, but I'm not positive on that. There's a European country that had a case before it where a company was found liable for the damages it was causing related with climate change and sea level rise. But then you have other situations like in the United States where there's been a lot of effort to have these companies held responsible, where there's been some success and there's been a lot of failure because it's very hard to show liability, a clear causation. Where it does matter, though, is that the wealthy countries that have benefited, a lot of their revenue, a lot of their GDP became from the growth that was pushed forward by fossil fuel through the industrialization process. And countries that maybe, especially in the Caribbean or the Pacific, that are low-lying island nations that didn't really benefit from industrialization to the extent that wealthier countries did, like Europe and the United States, are getting the biggest brunt of climate change, especially sea level rise. Countries that are only 1 to 2 feet above sea level are facing, and this is not an exaggeration, they're facing extinction, that they could lose their whole entire land mass due to climate change. And it leaves them without many resources and where to go. And so that's why they're really pushing for this loss and damage fund at the UN, and why there's been a lot of success around the recent agreement just in the last day to move forward with this fund.
So it seems like most countries in the world are in favor of stopping global warming. However, I'd like to point out that Russia benefits from sea level rise and global warming. That is to say, Moscow is 600 miles from the coastline and 350 feet above sea level. Their northern Urals are mineral deposits filled with petroleum products, and they would be more easily exploited if they could thaw out the permafrost covering over those mineral deposits. And Russia would benefit by having deep water ports on its northern border, which has never before in history had, because that would allow them to have rapid access to the rest of the world. Instead of going around continents, they could go straight down and go to all the major population areas in the world from northern seaports. They're also building more icebreakers than all the rest of the world put together. So I think they're beginning to take advantage of this potential opportunity. Have you seen any recognition that Russia, unlike the rest of the world, actually benefits from both sea level rise and global warming?
So that's a great question. And the correlation between defense and national security and climate change is strong. So there are going to be situations where you see, because of climate change, there being destabilization in different parts of the world that will have an impact on national security. As you pointed out, Russia's trying to kind of really take control of the Arctic. Because the ice is melting, they can become more mobile through these northern sea bases. But you're starting to see pushback on that, sort of an Arctic compact amongst nations, not including Russia, but like the United States, Canada, other Arctic nations, to really strengthen security so that Russia and other, let's say, malactors don't take advantage of it and don't destabilize the region. And so that's where you're starting to see that correlation between the impacts of climate change and the need for national security to recognize it.
So if in fact you were to get broader support for your activities, is that going to be because general public awareness of the dangers of fossil fuel exploitation just gradually fills out across the population, and the awareness of these dangers increases, and populations begin to hold companies accountable and change zoning laws and requirements to pay for the damage that companies create? Tell me what constellation of factors is going to help you guys get the public support you need to win this colossal, kind of almost existential battle of the planet. What needs to happen for you guys to get the public support you need?
I think, unfortunately, like a lot of situations, it's sort of like a smoking gun. And so you see that the impacts of climate change, those are what's really starting to change people's perceptions on the need for action. It's really hard to say, I didn't suffer that flood or I didn't see that hurricane, because it's happening, and it's happening now. And as we start to see more extreme weather related disasters that are a direct result of climate change, we're starting to see a shift in people's perceptions about what needs to happen, especially in the adaptations front. There is broad bipartisan support for measures to help communities prepare and adapt to more extreme weather events. And while there's often debate about the causes of climate change, it's not easy to debate the impacts of climate change. And so I think that as you start to see more of these extreme disasters, and the more that people suffer, unfortunately, from them, you will start to see a big push to reform policies across the spectrum that exacerbate climate change.
So that's my next question. Give me your vision of the future that's successful. What happens to basically increase public support for your type of legislative actions? Just show me this rosy future. What happens? Sure. Public opinion changes, governments change, public policy changes, away from fossil fuels to renewables. What's the model look like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now?
You just painted it. We start to remove fossil fuels from our economy, transition to cleaner energy, both in terms of where we source the energy. So looking at more wind and solar, to the type of transportation that we use. So more electric vehicles, more energy efficient transportation, even to the buildings in which we inhabit, decarbonizing some of the older infrastructure that we have that tends to be very carbon intensive because they require a lot of heat, cooling, because they're not well insulated or they weren't built, with the kind of future climate in mind. And so you start to see a holistic approach to phasing out fossil fuels, reducing the amount of emissions that are going into the atmosphere so climate change doesn't continue to run amok. At the same time, you see measures that account for the climate impacts that are already happening. So that would be reforming the National Flood Insurance Program to make sure that structures better prepared for the future of more extreme floods. You see reform at zoning and building code level that pushes not only for the structures to be built safer, but more energy efficient, so people are more insulated from extreme heat or extreme cold. And this really kind of this holistic approach to making sure that there is a concerted effort at all levels of government to account for and prepare for the impacts of climate change.
What percentage of global warming is caused by transportation?
I don't know off the top of my head. I tend to more focus on the adaptation side, not the emission side. I'd have to look that up. I don't want to guess and be wrong.
What about free metro transit? What about one way that cities could improve their climate and protect against global warming by providing free metro transit? Most of it's electric, and so it's a better form of transportation anyway. And by providing free metro transit, you would basically get people out of their cars and get people onto a greener form of transportation.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And it aligns with the idea of just enacting policies that help reduce the reliance on individual transportation on your vehicle, or even on, let's say, short plane flights. So if we can, as a country and as states, invest in more public transportation options, so better local lines, better passenger train lines between major cities, especially, I think the United States is very far behind in comparison to Europe and to China and to Japan on high-speed rail between short distances between cities. That could really improve carbon emissions, because it's, I think, more efficient than your short plane flight or driving yourself. And so I think, yeah, policies that really encourage more public transportation options are going to be beneficial.
So what's standing between you and success, it sounds like, is government action, which means legislation, which means people in Congress and the Senate. Do you have a slate of candidates that you endorse who you believe are greener candidates?
So NRDC, the nonprofit, the 501c3, does not endorse candidates. That would be in violation of our tax provisions. But the Action Fund, which is a separate entity and a 501c4 institution, does endorse candidates. Because I belong to the 501c organization, I can't talk about endorsing candidates because that would be a violation of our tax provisions. But I can say that the NRDC Action Fund does endorse candidates and has done in the past. And I'd recommend looking at the NRDC Action Fund webpage, and you can see some of the candidates that they have endorsed.
The little bit of research that I'm familiar with on this subject has shown that younger people are more prone to change their actions because of climate change. Is there a kind of a direct line, younger people being more supportive of your actions than older folks?
I believe so, there is, because I think younger folks realize that they're going to be the ones that are going to start feeling the impacts of climate change, especially in the coming decades. And they are the ones that are going to have to be responsible for sort of making those hard decisions going forward to make sure that if climate change does get pretty bad, does become extreme because of policy failures today, that they can survive. And so I think that's why you start to see a lot of younger people really push for climate change legislation. But it's not just, I think, the younger population. You're starting to see broader support for adaptation measures and information sharing. So we've conducted some polling, NRDC has conducted some polling about the importance of real estate disclosure. And especially in states in the East Coast that don't have good real estate disclosure laws, we've conducted polling to see, what would be the support there to make a more stronger requirement for sellers to tell buyers about past flood damages. And we saw actually broad bipartisan support, upwards of 80 to 90% support for these measures, because people want to make sure that they're protecting themselves from flooding. And so I think a lot of it comes down to how you kind of frame the issue and what impacts that you're discussing, that you can go beyond just your kind of what you would normally think would be supportive to, or people you would think that would be supportive to kind of a broader population.
So I've seen kind of an explosion of fossil fuel lobbyists. And NFIP in Egypt, it seemed like there were more fossil fuel lobbyists than there were representatives of governments wishing for responsible climate action. Talk to us a little bit about the number of fossil fuel lobbyists and how big fossil fuel companies have taken to the lobbying front. It's like they want to be members of the big climate conferences so that they can move the agendas of those conferences in their direction. Talk about that.
I think you'll always see bad actors when it comes to trying to push forward sound climate legislation. People who, the fossil fuel industry has to, operate in their own self-interest. And I think that's why you see that huge investment in the lobbyists, because they are trying to push back against, measures that would reduce reliance on fossil fuel. But you are also seeing a lot of countries, a lot of nonprofits like NRDC pushing back standing up for people who are impacted by climate change, standing up for people on the front line, and really challenging the status quo and saying that things have to change, that we need policies in place that are going to address the impacts of climate change. We need policies in place that are going to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because the alternative is a future which is very untenable. You do see lobbyists from BP and the other oil companies, but you're also starting to see a lot of action from people who are going to be impacted. And I think that's starting to drown out those voices of the other actors. Well, I can't speak to the increase in the lobbyists because I'm not familiar with those figures. What I can say is that there is progress being made. You are seeing countries come together to address climate change and address the impacts of climate change. And you're seeing action from the Biden administration to do exactly that, whether that's through the Infrastructure Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or through the Inflation Reduction Act. You are seeing the United States government take action to address climate change. And that is often a direct result of pressure from groups like NRDC, from people on the front line, from those who are impacted by climate change, really trying to push the Biden administration to change. And so that's why, at the end of the day, yeah, maybe they have more lobbyists in Egypt than they did in Glasgow, but I don't think that's going to stop the initiative and the movement to change and address climate change.
We've just all experienced a change from one administration to a different administration. So are you finding much more receptive ears in DC with the current administration than you did with the previous 4-year administration?
I'd say the short answer is yes.
I assume that would be your answer, but I just want to be sure. It's increasingly evident that preventing climate change will be less expensive and more efficient than repairing after climate change, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's going to be not doing anything is going to cost more than taking action now. It's kind of, think about it in terms of like saving for retirement. It costs money to save for retirement. But if you don't, at the end of the day, you're in a worse off situation than you were before when it comes time to not being able to work anymore. And it's the same with climate change. Like, yes, it costs money now to address climate change, but if we do nothing, we're going to be worse off than we were before. And so I think that's what it really comes down to, is that it makes just fiscal sense to address the impacts of climate change because of the harm that would result from not doing anything.
So Joel Scata of the Natural Resources Defense Fund, many of us in the aquatic realm that spend our time sailing or powerboating around sort of forget that we do need cops to pay attention to public policy and make sure that the water we're sailing and powering through stays clean. And so thanks very much for the good work you're doing to keep our waters clean and to help us mitigate climate change and help us, in fact, decrease sea level rise. It's really important. And members of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, I want to thank you very much for your stalwart work on our behalf.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
for having me.
And with that, we adjourn the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thank you, Joel.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.